In this section, I want to take a closer look at defining biological sex. Now, in one sense, it might seem strange that I haven't addressed this question earlier in the presentation, even though I have alluded to it. But regardless of where I address it in the overall presentation, considering defining biological sex is an important question we need to consider. And from the outset, I want to point out that our sex chromosomes don't necessarily define our biological sex. Now, that might surprise some people, particularly with all of the discussion of sex chromosomes that has been in this presentation so far. But we need to be very careful to distinguish between a sex-determining system and defining biological sex. As we have seen, humans, along with other mammals, have an XY chromosomal sex-determining system. But as we have also seen, some reptiles have a temperature-dependent sex-determining system. Moreover, birds, for instance, have a ZW chromosomal sex-determining system, which is different to the ones humans have again. So how do we define biological sex consistently across creatures that have different sex-determining systems? Well, the consistent answer given by many biologists is that sex is determined by the type of gamete you produce, either sperm or eggs. So, for instance, here's a quote from a recent book in genetics that I have quoted several times throughout this presentation. From a genetic standpoint, the phenotypes of sex, male and female, depend on which type of gamete an individual produces. If an individual produces sperm or has the potential to produce sperm when mature, it's considered male. If the individual can produce eggs, it's considered female. Now, even though that book comes from, it is titled Genetics for Dummies, so it has the word dummies in the title, that book was still written by two PhD biologists, so their perspective should carry some weight. Here's another quote regarding defining biological sex, and this comes from a book that I quoted in the previous section on epigenetics. And this quote is from a geneticist who was a professor at the University of Sydney for many years. Biological sex has a precise meaning. Males are the sex that produce small gametes, typically pollen and sperm, and females are the sex that produce large gametes, seeds and eggs. Now, we can emphasize this point even further by quoting even more famous scientists, such as Jerry Coyne, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Chicago. This is what he has to say. In biology, sex is traditionally defined by the size and mobility of reproductive cells, gametes. Males have small, mobile gametes, sperm in animals and pollen in plants. Females have large, immobile gametes, ova in plants, and eggs in animals. So you see, there is consistent testimony across many biologists that sex is defined by the type of gamete you produce. Now, definitions like this are helpful, but they can be enhanced with further clarification. For instance, Jerry Coyne, in the article that I just quoted, also points out that this definition is really a generalization based on a vast number of observations of diverse organisms. But he insists that despite focusing on gamete type to distinguish males from females, that doesn't mean that a postmenopausal female because she no longer produces eggs, is no longer female. I mean, that would be a ridiculous extrapolation of this principle. Likewise, if you have an individual who has a female phenotype and develops female reproductive structures, but some medical condition impedes her ability to produce eggs, that doesn't disqualify her from being a female either. That would be another ridiculous extrapolation of this principle. Likewise, if you have an individual who has a male phenotype and male reproductive structures, but some medical condition impedes his ability to produce sperm, that doesn't disqualify him from being a male either. So, for instance, back in the section on genetic surprises, we saw that XXSRY plus males develop a male phenotype and male reproductive structures, but because they are missing certain genes on the Y chromosome, they can't produce viable sperm. But they're obviously male because they've developed a male phenotype that developed the body plan around producing sperm, even though there is a deficiency. Likewise, in the section on genetic surprises, we also saw that XY females with Swyer syndrome develop a female phenotype, but because they don't develop functional ovaries, they cannot produce eggs. But they are obviously female because they have produced the female phenotype and female body plan, even though there is a deficiency. So perhaps this definition can be enhanced by referring to gamete type and producing a body plan around the production of that gamete type, even if there is a deficiency. So, females are the sex that produce eggs and develop a body plan around producing eggs, and males are the sex that produce sperm and develop a body plan around producing sperm. Now, the reason that I am emphasizing this point so much is that by keeping a fairly robust definition of biological sex in mind, you are less likely to be bamboozled when you consider variation in sex-influence traits. So let's look at some examples. But before I do this section, I think it's worth acknowledging that people like Zachary Elliott and Dr. Colin Wright have articulated this form of argument very well. So let's start by looking at a sex-influence trait such as height. Height is a sex-influence trait. Males tend to be taller than females on average. And so this graph that I show here shows a normal distribution for height in males. You'll notice that the mean or average is about 175 centimetres. That's meant to be the average height of males in Australia. And so notice I've labelled an individual. Let's assume we've got an individual who is that exact height, and I've labelled him male A. But now let's also consider another male who is much taller, 2 metres tall or 200 centimetres tall to be precise, and I have labelled that individual male B. Now I want you to consider an important question, and the question is this: is male B more male than male A? Now, I trust the answer is obvious. Male B is not more male than male A. Male B is simply a taller male. And because the important point here is that when we consider variation in the height of males, we are not considering what defines males, we are just considering variation in a sex-influence trait. So let's consider a third male. Male C I've labelled, who is shorter than average. This individual is 168 centimetres. And we can ask the question, is male C less male than male A and male B? Now, once again, the answer is obvious. Male C is not less male, he is simply a shorter male. So we know that in things like height, males can vary significantly from each other, but that's actually not what defines biological males. Let's now consider height in females. So I've actually superimposed on this graph a normal distribution for height in females. Now in Australia, the average for females is meant to be about 162 centimetres. So I've labelled an individual there, female A, someone who is this exact height. But let's now consider another individual who's significantly taller, a female who is 180 centimetres. Which I've labelled female B. Now, hopefully it's obvious that female B is not more female than female A. Female B is simply a taller female. But what about the question that is female B more male? Because if you actually look at the height, female B is actually taller than the male average. Well, the answer here is an obvious, emphatic no. Female B is not more male, she is simply a taller female, and females vary significantly from each other in their height. So the point I'm making here, of course, is that in sex-influenced traits like height, males and females can vary very significantly from each other, but it's not actually what defines males and females. Now, we could repeat this exercise for all sorts of secondary sexual characteristics. So, for instance, if we considered a normal distribution for facial hair in males, because males vary in this secondary sexual characteristic. Some males can produce a lot of facial hair, and other males only have a little bit of facial hair that they can grow. But once again, that isn't what defines males, the amount of facial hair they have. So you'll find a lot of variation in males in the amount of facial hair that they grow, but that's actually not what defines males. What defines males is the gamete type they produce and the body plan they develop around the production of that gamete type. Another example we can consider is the deepness of the adult male voice. And so once again, some men have really deep voices and some not so deep. But once again, this doesn't define whether they're male or not. It's just variation in a secondary sexual characteristic that we see in males. But we can continue this thought experiment by things really come into sharper focus, in fact, when we consider testosterone levels in males, because males vary in this as well. So now on this graph here, I don't have any hard figures. It's simply conceptual, but I still think it makes the point clearly. So here we see on this normal distribution, we've got a male with the average level of testosterone, male A. But now imagine we had another male who was an athlete, and to enhance his performance, he illegally took extra testosterone to enhance his testosterone levels and increase his athletic performance and muscle bulk and so on. Now, in that instance there, we still wouldn't say, well, he's obviously more male. He's simply a male with more testosterone, because when we consider testosterone levels in males, we're still not considering what defines males. Now, another thing about testosterone levels is that they are known to decrease in men over time. When men reach their late 30s or early 40s, from that point on, their testosterone levels tend to decline. So let's consider a third male here, and I've just on the graph there, I've just put an elderly male. Now, he represents someone with much lower levels of testosterone. But we don't think of that elderly male and go, oh, well, he's less male because he has lower testosterone levels. Of course not. Because once again, we are not considering what defines males. We are simply looking at variation in a certain trait found within males. But how about if we consider whether a female takes testosterone? Remember, we learnt previously from the Endocrine Society that females have testosterone too, but in much smaller amounts than men. So if a female takes lots of testosterone, as we learnt in a previous section, they are likely to develop secondary sexual characteristics, masculine secondary sexual characteristics, such as a deeper voice, more facial hair, more muscle bulk, and so on. However, that won't change them definitionally, in the sense that no matter how much testosterone they take, it's not going to change the gamete type they produce. It's not going to change their eggs into sperm. Now, we could also try this thought experiment in regard to estrogen levels in females, because this is something that changes over time in females as well. So for example, a 25-year-old female is going to have much higher estrogen levels than a 60-year-old female. But we don't say, oh, well, the 60-year-old female is obviously less female. Now, that doesn't make any sense. And once again, because we're looking at a trait in females that varies amongst females and varies over time, but it's still not what actually defines females. But remember too, we also learnt about males do have some estrogen. And so males, we also learned from the Endocrine Society that males have estrogen too, but in smaller amounts. And so what would that mean if I took lots and lots of estrogen? Well, remember we learnt in a previous section that would likely mean that I would develop lots of feminine secondary sexual characteristics. So for instance, I would develop softer skin, I would have a body fat redistribution, I'm also likely to eventually develop breasts. But once again, that is not going to change me in a definitional sense, because no matter how much estrogen I take, it's not going to change the type of gamete I produce. It's not going to change my sperm into eggs. It's not going to change the body plan that I've developed around producing sperm into one that produces eggs. So I find this really helpful. By keeping a fairly robust definition of biological sex in mind, you're less likely to be bamboozled when you consider variations in various traits found within males and females. Males vary a lot in their height and their facial hair and the deepness of their voice and their hormone levels, but that's simply variation within males. Likewise, females vary significantly in height and other anatomical characteristics and also hormone levels. But once again, that's just variation within females. And in one sense, it's really good that people vary a lot, because the world would be a very boring place if we were all exactly the same. So in this section, we have looked at defining biological sex. And in the final episode, the next section, I'm going to summarize things and come to a conclusion.